Thanks very much, Dominique, for the invitation to talk about this. Of course, like as with all forms of teaching, I'm the one who learns the most from this experience, and I was glad to have a chance to dig into it a little bit more than I otherwise might have done. I don't know if you'd consider this a relevant disclosure. Jason Kenney might consider it a conflict of interest, but I'll leave you to evaluate that. These are my few and simple objectives, and I do want to point out, which in fact I added after listening to Shirley, that there are a lot of potential health impacts related to climate change, or perhaps we should call it global heating, that are not mediated through communicable diseases, and those are potentially very important, but I'm not going to be talking about them. So one of my main messages is that it's pretty tough to predict what's going to happen because there are so many variables involved. And to start with, climate change itself is complicated, and we're not that good at predicting outcomes. So it's not just a linear phenomenon as temperature rises, but there are all these unpredictable events, the extreme weather events, and these feedback cycles that we're starting to learn about, like methane release from melting permafrost, the effects of fire, and so forth. Anyway, you've heard more from real experts about that, and I just want to highlight that the complications and variables of climate change have to be kind of multiplied with all the complications and variables involved in the impact on communicable disease. So for sure, once again, relationships with temperature may be very much non-linear, and I'm going to talk a bit about malaria later on. Other impacts of global heating, other than just temperature, such as major changes that Shirley showed on precipitation, rain and moisture, as you can imagine, could have a huge impact on, for example, vector-borne disease, but also water-related disease and so on. And lastly, we have ways of mitigating some of these effects, particularly with some of the vector-borne diseases. So the outcomes on some of these diseases may not be just what you would predict, because we could actually do something about it, which of course is not necessarily a bad thing. So the result is that a great deal of what I'm going to be talking about is based on speculation of what might logically happen, and on increasing use of modeling techniques. But I will try to flag some of the limited number of situations where there are already data on changes that have occurred. So once again, everything that happens and everything that's new, even if it's occurring in a temporal relationship with climate change or global heating, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a cause and effect relationship there. So some of the big health effects that we've seen in the past, like plague and yellow fever and HIV, don't have any likely relationship to climate change. More more recent major events like the big West African Ebola epidemic and all three SARS events, including COVID. I think Dominic might have been wondering about a possible connection with COVID, and I'm afraid I wasn't able to find any convincing way to make that connection. Of course, influenza is a health event that occurs every year and might have some climate-related effects. But I guess my point is that we can't blame climate change for all communicable disease health events, even ones that have occurred in a temporal relationship with what's happening with climate change. So let's think about how could this work? How could climate change impact communicable diseases? And these are the three main ways that I was able to encounter and reading and thinking about it. So a variety of mechanisms related to changes in water, flooding and major climate events, and drought. Climate-driven migration, I think, might be proved to be very important. And the most concrete area, and one I can most easily relate to, is related to vector-borne, potential impacts on vector-borne diseases. So starting with water, so drought, obviously, or water stress could be huge. And so this is just one reference to increasing evidence that a large part of the world's population is already becoming influenced by water stress, and that's likely to increase markedly in the next number of years. So one of the things we teach in public health is that access to water, and especially clean water, of course, and related sanitation, which is connected to how clean your water is of fundamental importance to human health, and arguably has accounted for the largest part of the dramatic improvements in life expectancy, for example, in the last century. So if we start going backward in terms of access to clean water due to climate change effects, we are likely to see a return of the whole spectrum of fecal-orally transmitted diseases. And there can be other mechanisms that water access could influence health. So what are sometimes referred to as the water wash diseases, the diseases like skin and soft tissue infections that are prevented by hygiene and staying clean, and trachoma, chlamydial eye disease. And maybe, I'll touch on this later, schistosomiasis is, of course, very much a water-related disease, probably impacted much more by other human changes like irrigation and building dams, but possibly could be impacted by climate. So one of those non-linear effects of climate change is these extreme weather events, which Shirley has shown are likely to increase dramatically in the future. And of course, they're going to have huge health impacts, and probably much of it is going to be mediated by communicable diseases. So when you have floods, you're going to have loss of clean water supplies, wells, and et cetera. We know from the flooding in BC this past summer that they lost their water supply and had to have one of the interventions needed to be the provision of clean water to everybody. So we can do that in Canada in a localized area, but that trucking in water may just not be an option in large areas of low-income countries. A disease that many of you might not be so familiar with, but appears to be a major impact of flooding events is leptospirosis, which is a spirochete that's found in fresh water. It's reservoirs in rodents. And so that might be an impact we haven't thought of flooding events in particular. And of course, these events are going to disrupt all kinds of important services and infrastructure, specifically including water supply, but also sanitation, public health services, healthcare, vector control programs, food supply, and so forth. So lots of potential things that could be going on. So those were a few comments about impact mediated via various water-related effects. So what about the migration question? So here's a report from a pretty recent report from the World Bank. And so they're saying they're just focusing on three areas that include more than half of the developing world or low-income country populations. And they're predicting that by 2050, more than 143 million people, or almost 3% of the population of those regions, could be forced to move due to climate change impacts. And so we're talking about water availability, of course, for normal human uses, drinking and washing, but also very importantly for agricultural use and productivity. And then also rising sea level and storm surges, all those things could drive migration. And they're saying these are predicted up to 2050, but then they think migration will accelerate after that point. And remember, this is just talking about internal migration, and we're not talking about cross-border migration, which will have all those other economic and political impacts that we've already seen in Europe, for example. And so we know, we have some idea what the health impacts of migration are, because we already see it, and they're just mostly the worsening of health effects related to poverty, poor living conditions, and of course, breakdown or lack of access to both preventive and curative health care. Maybe sometimes moving from non-malarious areas into a malarious area, for example. And then migration is related to conflict and all that goes with that, including communicable disease impacts, which I'm not going to take it to that extra level. So let's talk about vector-borne diseases, and I'm going to focus on three for which there's pretty convincing evidence of changes. So most of you know malaria is a pretty important disease, and I've highlighted some figures here to emphasize that. So the temperature may impact malaria directly, but changes in rainfall, precipitation, and water distribution would have a huge impact, not surprisingly, on the Anopheles mosquito vector. But temperature can affect it directly, can affect the, Stephanie Yano can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the number that sticks in my mind is that for falciparum malaria, the mosquito cycle to be successful, the temperature has to remain above 18 degrees Celsius. But in fact, very high temperatures can actually be bad for the parasite replication. And we've got another player here, so another variable. What about mosquito survival? If it's too cold or too warm, and of course too wet or too dry, the mosquitoes aren't going to do well. And maybe temperature might affect their biting habits, which could affect malaria transmission. So you can see a lot of variables, a lot of possibilities happening here. Yeah, in fact, the temperature being too high could actually be bad for the parasite and for the or for the mosquito. So is it happening? The answer is yes. In some areas, it's been documented that malaria is moving up the hills and mountains. Typically in the higher, cooler altitudes, malaria transmission may not have occurred, and that is changing in areas of the Western Pacific and Africa. In the other direction, though, one of the most important malaria vectors actually seems to be decreasing, and this appears to be related to decreased precipitation and water supply. And I'll just show you a map here. So this is the current situation, and then these are three different scenarios, all of which show decreased distribution of Anopheles arabiniensis. I think I've got that right. So that highlights yet another variable that, of course, all this modeling, different assumptions lead to different outcomes. Should we worry here in Canada? Not today for sure, but I guess an important point here is that malaria control measures have been highly effective, particularly at the kind of borders of malaria transmission zones. So this is one climate impact that we should be able to mitigate quite effectively. Or another way of looking at it is that climate impacts may be difficult to parse out from the effects of control measures. Dengue. So I'll say a little bit more because people may be a little bit less familiar with this disease. It's a flavivirus, and it's transmitted by two species of the Aedes mosquito genus. So it's super common, as I'll show you in a minute. It's often what does it do to people? It's often asymptomatic. It can cause a non-specific and self-limiting illness with a fever and sometimes a rash. But in a pretty small minority of people, it can cause severe, even life-threatening disease. We don't have a treatment, and we're kind of working on a vaccine, I would say. But this is a disease with a huge population impact. So what is this? Close to a third of the world's population is potentially exposed. This figure is not a mistaken extra zero here. There are thought to be close to 400 million infections a year, of which 100 million are actually symptomatic illness. So it's a hugely important vector-borne disease. Of course, this is where it's found in tropical areas currently. Kind of surprising how it seems to affect tropical Africa, perhaps less than tropical Americas, Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. But here is the key point. Dengue has been increasing dramatically, 30-fold increase in human cases in the last 50 years. So here's a a place where you might be asking yourself, is this due to climate change, since it kind of correlates with what we know is happening with climate change trends. There has also been some geographic expansion, which would be where you can make an even better case for a relationship to climate change. Aedes aegypti, which is a really important human disease mosquito, is the predominant vector, but in fact, the colorfully named Asian tiger mosquito, Albopictus, might have increasing importance because this mosquito has a greater capacity to replicate in more temperate climatic areas. It can certainly transmit dengue, maybe less efficient than the aegypti, though. I had to show you this picture because it's such a beautiful animal. So should we be blaming what we're seeing on climate change? You know, probably other factors are having greater impact. Urbanization, a major decline in vector control, particularly in Latin America, where they've been very successful directed at yellow fever way back in the 50s and 60s, and now that control is breaking down. It just doesn't seem to be that new cases are large numbers are attributable to Aedes albopictus. And the numbers are increasing more than the geographic area, but that is not to say that climate change may not be contributing and may not be really important in the future. This just shows how the Aedes aegypti control measures had become very successful in Latin America, and now they're fading away, and that's not climate change. So there is some evidence and some modeling indicating increased expansion of Aedes albopictus to fill an ecological niche, but subsequently in response to anthropogenic climate change, that this is likely to increase, increasing now, but especially after 2050. Here's again some models showing expansion. As you can see, we're getting up into Canada here. So we could, this is for Aedes albopictus. So we could be seeing potential for dengue transmission in Canada, although this is projecting pretty far into the future, 2080. What about diseases that have other vectors, in this case, snails? So fasciola, a liver fluke, really, it looks like the snail vector is now able to overwinter in increasing areas, and this is likely to be a relevant problem. And this is a major animal husbandry problem, as well as being a potential human disease. Schistosomiasis, as I mentioned, probably not mostly climate mediated, but it's now been found in Corsica. To the best of my knowledge, it never existed in Europe before. So Lyme disease, that's potentially relevant to Canada. And of course, the
Stan,
mechanism is
Stan, just letting you know, there's 3 minutes left.
Okay, I think I'm about right. This is the vector. And you can see that the projected distribution of the exodes could increase markedly in coming years with climate change, 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s. So it could impact tick density, geographic range, the biting season. That could be very, very important. And maybe they'll start behaving differently under different conditions. And it's not just the temperature, but also changes that occur with humidity and rainfall. And then independent of the ticks themselves, what happens to the animal reservoirs, deer and deer mice could be critical. So this is predicted increase in Ixodes ticks in Ontario. Lyme is increasing in Europe. It's increasing in the States. It's moved up into Ontario and Nova Scotia. So this is happening. And there are other diseases transmitted by ticks, including the Ixodes tick. Probably we are likely to be able to mitigate waterborne impacts, at least at a small scale, as we were able to do in the British Columbia floods. What about migration? I can't even pretend to predict what we might see, climate-driven migration from Latin America, for example. And I have to mention, because of my One Health interest, that climate change related infection could affect animals, parasitic diseases. Maybe some of you have heard of the anthrax outbreak in Siberian reindeer that occurred with the thawing of permafrost. So we would be particularly worried about new diseases, emerging diseases. And here's a kind of a micro example, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which occurred perhaps not with climate change, but with an unusual climate perturbation that led to more pine nuts, more deer mice, and therefore more exposure of deer mice to humans. So how should we respond to this? Well, obviously we should be responding to climate change. That's number one. We do need to ramp up surveillance. We do need to give serious thought to mitigation measures. And as I have alluded to, on the plus side, some of these diseases might be more susceptible to mitigation measures that we already have experience with than is the case with some other climate impacts. So it's going to happen. It's already happening, but it's pretty tough to predict. And with that, I'll close.